Jared didn't fall out of love with his wife. He just fell into something he couldn't name, with someone who looked like her, but felt completely different. He met Mason at a family dinner. Jared had been married to Melissa for 3 years by then, and yet he'd never met her twin brother. Mason had been living abroad, teaching music in Prague. He returned unexpectedly one summer, stepping into their backyard with a bottle of wine, a crooked smile, and eyes that matched Melissa's in shape, but not in weight. Where Melissa was soft-spoken and careful, Mason was fire in motion. His words came fast, laced with humor and provocation. He hugged people too long. He laughed too loudly, and when he looked at Jared across the patio table, it felt like being seen through. Jared chalked it up to curiosity. A man like Mason was hard not to look at. He drew attention like gravity. Jared assumed it was admiration, or maybe intimidation. He'd never been good with people who disrupted the air around them. But it was something else. Something unspoken. Something that made Jared's throat dry whenever Mason touched his shoulder or leaned too close while pouring another glass of wine. Melissa didn't notice. Or if she did, she didn't say anything. Jared watched Mason that night more than he intended. The way his lips moved when he spoke. The rings on his fingers. The way he crossed his legs like he owned every room. At home, in the dark, Melissa curled into Jared's side like always. He held her, he loved her, but when he closed his eyes, it wasn't her voice he heard. The next morning, Jared found himself staring into the bathroom mirror longer than usual. His own reflection felt distant. He tried to shake it, blamed the wine, the tension from work, but a single thought lodged in his mind and refused to move. He shouldn't feel this way. Over the following weeks, Mason became a regular presence. Dinners, game nights, walks with Melissa to the farmer's market. Jared began avoiding him, choosing work deadlines over social plans. But it didn't help. Avoidance became preoccupation. He thought about what Mason would say about the clients Jared worked with. The colors he used, the books on his shelf. He hated that he cared. Then one night, Jared walked into the kitchen and found Mason alone, leaning against the counter, eating leftovers straight from the pan. Melissa's upstairs, Mason said without turning around. Jared nodded. I know. There was a pause, heavy, not awkward, but full. Mason looked over his shoulder. You always this tense, or just when I'm around? Jared didn't answer. He just stared. Mason smiled, slow, crooked, and without apology. You don't have to be afraid of what this is, he said, voice low. What is? Jared shot back too fast. Mason stepped closer. Whatever it is that makes your eyes follow me like you're waiting for permission. Jared's pulse spiked. He stepped back. Good night, he muttered. Mason didn't stop him, but his voice followed Jared out the door. You'll dream about this, just wait. He did, and the dreams were worse than desire. They were soft, intimate. Mason's fingers on the back of his neck. Laughter under shared blankets. Silence that felt safe. Jared woke up guilty. He tried harder with Melissa. More flowers, more effort. He planned a weekend getaway. But the guilt didn't erase the pull. It only buried it deeper. It would have stayed there, too, locked in some corner of his mind, until the night Melissa fell asleep on the couch. And Mason sent him a message. Still up? Jared stared at the screen for a full minute. Then he replied, yeah, come over. He would later tell himself it was just conversation. That they sat in the backyard and talked about life and Prague and music. That no one touched anyone. That it was innocent, but it wasn't, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't need to. It started with a message about Melissa's birthday. Jared wanted to plan something special. Mason suggested a private dinner, a song, maybe, something intimate. Their texts were short at first, logistics, ideas. But then came the jokes, the late-night memes, the shared sarcasm over group chats and awkward family stories. By the end of the first week, they were texting past midnight. Jared didn't notice how often he checked his phone, or how Melissa began glancing at him across the couch with an unreadable look. Some nights, Melissa worked the overnight shift. Those nights stretched long. Mason would message, "Still awake?" Jared always was. The first time they met alone. It was framed as casual. Jared dropped off a book Mason had asked to borrow. They talked for an hour. About Prague, about art, about Melissa, about nothing. The second time, Jared brought wine. That night, the conversation wandered. From music to loneliness. From the weight of expectations to the strange quiet between the things they didn't say. Mason reached for the wineglass in Jared's hand. Their fingers touched, held. Neither moved away. Jared left without looking back. The third time wasn't accidental. After an argument with Melissa about his constant distance, "You're here. But you're not here." He got in the car and drove. Mason opened the door like he'd been waiting. "Came to check on the book?" he asked. "No," Jared said. "I came because I can't not." Mason didn't answer. He stepped aside. Let him in. It happened quickly. No speeches. No music. Just hands. Breath. A kiss pressed between silence and inevitability. Afterward, they didn't speak. Jared sat on the edge of Mason's bed. Fully clothed again. Staring at the floor. Mason lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it. He held it like a habit he'd quit and missed. "You should go," he said. Jared nodded. He left before the sun rose. The sky still bruised with night. The next morning, Melissa made coffee like nothing had changed. But everything had. Jared couldn't stop replaying it. Not the kiss, the silence, the moment after, when he didn't feel shame, just clarity. Mason didn't text that day. Or the next. Jared wanted to say something. Apologize. Deny. Pretend. But instead, they pretended together. When Mason came over for dinner that weekend, Melissa smiled as she passed the salad. Jared almost dropped the fork when their fingers brushed. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah, just tired." Later, when Mason got up to leave, he didn't hug Jared. He hugged Melissa, told her she looked radiant, winked at her joke. Then he looked at Jared and said nothing. Jared didn't sleep that night. He lay next to Melissa, listening to the sound of her breathing, wondering if guilt always felt this much like grief. The next morning, she touched his shoulder. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He shook his head, but something in her eyes said she already knew. Maybe not what, but enough. The dinner was Melissa's idea. 5 years of marriage. She wanted to celebrate quietly, just family. Close friends. Warm lights strung across the backyard. Jared helped her string 'em up the day before. His hands trembling when Mason arrived with a bottle of champagne. "You look like you haven't slept," Mason said, not smiling. "I haven't," Jared replied, eyes avoiding his. The evening began like every other family gathering. Small talk. Wine. Shared laughter. Melissa wore a pale blue dress Jared hadn't seen in years. She looked radiant. He told her so. She kissed his cheek and squeezed his hand like everything was whole. Jared sat across from Mason at the long dinner table. The candles flickered between them. Their eyes met only once. It lasted less than a second. But it said everything. Halfway through dessert, Melissa stood up. She raised her glass, her smile steady. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. 5 years, it's gone fast. Hasn't it, Jared?" He nodded, smiled, though his lips barely moved. "And I want to thank my husband, for his patience, his steadiness, and his love." People clapped softly. She turned to Mason. "And thank you, my brother. You came back when I needed you most. You reminded me that love comes in many forms." Jared's breath caught. Melissa's tone didn't shift, but her eyes had grown sharper. "Some love, though," she said, placing her glass down carefully, "isn't meant to be held. Just understood, and then, released." She reached beneath the table and pulled out a small envelope. Opened it, pulled out a single photo. Laid it gently on the table between the wineglasses. It was a still from the security camera in their living room. Jared and Mason, kissing. Silence fell like snow. No one moved, no one breathed. The candles kept flickering. Mason was the first to stand. He didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. He walked out the back door without a word. Jared wanted to run after him, to explain, to scream, but he couldn't move. Melissa sat back down, Her hand trembled as she reached for her wine. She sipped it slowly, eyes locked on the glass. Not him. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. And that, somehow, was worse. The room filled with a quiet that had shape. It pressed in on his ribs, on his lungs, on the shame that bloomed like bruises under his skin. Melissa finally spoke. "You broke more than a vow, Jared. You broke something that doesn't grow back." Her voice was low, flat, like a verdict. He nodded, though it felt hollow. The guests began to leave. Silently, one by one, like mourners. The last to go was her cousin, who kissed her cheek, then looked at Jared like she could see through him. When the door shut, Jared and Melissa were alone. She collected the plates, washed them. He watched her dry the photo last. Then she went upstairs, and he stayed at the table until dawn. The divorce was filed quietly. No fighting, no statements, no press. Melissa didn't speak to reporters. She didn't post on social media. She simply moved forward, with the grace of someone who had already made peace with what she'd lost long before it was taken. Jared signed the papers without contest. Property was divided, custody arranged. There were no surprises, until the envelope. It was left on the kitchen table of their now empty house. Inside, a handwritten letter on ivory paper. "I forgive you, but Ethan will need a different kind of man to look up to. One who tells the truth even when it burns. One who doesn't confuse love with hiding." It wasn't cruel. That made it harder. Jared folded the letter and placed it in a box he didn't unpack. Mason moved to New York a week later. No goodbye, no message. Jared sent a dozen texts, then 2 dozen, then stopped counting, all left on read. Eventually, Mason's number disconnected. Time passed like molasses. Days folded into months. The space Mason left behind was hollow but loud. Jared could still hear his voice in the places they'd shared. Work became routine. The apartment stayed dim. Friends drifted. 1 year later, Jared sat in a folding chair in a church basement, next to a circle of strangers. The sign read, "Group Therapy, Emotional Recovery." He wasn't sure why he came. When it was his turn to speak, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a letter he'd written months ago but never mailed. "I loved the wrong person. Or maybe I loved at the wrong time. But it was the only time I felt real. I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I lost someone who couldn't stay. And I'm learning that truth doesn't come with comfort. It just comes." No one in the room interrupted. No one judged. The silence afterward felt different this time. Less sharp, more like stitching. That weekend, Jared visited the park where he used to take Ethan for bike rides. Fall had painted everything amber. A breeze shook the branches, scattering leaves in soft spirals. He sat on the same bench by the path, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. A pair of identical twin boys rode past, laughing. Jared looked away. His eyes burned. It wasn't jealousy, not grief. It was the weight of something he couldn't undo. He stayed until dusk, then walked home, not healed, not forgiven, just learning how to be alone in a world that no longer bent to his desire. And maybe that was the beginning. Jared lost his marriage, his family, and the version of himself he thought was safe. But some betrayals aren't rooted in desire. They're buried in paperwork, in history, in the lies people never thought they had to tell. Next, we travel to San Antonio, where Monica thought she'd caught her husband cheating. But what she discovered in that hotel room wasn't another woman. It was another life, one she was never told existed. Coming up next, Monica from San Antonio. She followed the hotel receipt, then found a family secret.